Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Sharon Rich. I'm the Senior Trust Advisor at Aged Trust, where we manage pooled trust and other types of special needs trusts for seniors and persons with disabilities who need to qualify for Medicaid and have too much money. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for attending today's webinar on veterans benefits. The program today is approved for continuing ed credits for guardians and attorneys, and you will receive an email from Kate at trustaged.org within the next week with your certificate of attendance and a copy of the presentation and a link to the recorded presentation. This will be posted to our website for later viewing for you. And we do have a large audience today, so please put your questions into chat and we will leave time to answer those questions at the end. I am very excited today to have our speaker, attorney Randy Bryan, going over the VA benefits with you. Randy is a top elder law and board certified attorney in wills, trusts, and estates and elder law. We are very fortunate at Aged to have Randy as our legal advisor. He wrote our pooled master trust and all our legal documents for us almost 21 years ago to the day. So he asked me not to read his entire bio because we don't want to spend too much time on the call with that. But Randy is one of the smartest attorneys I know. So Randy, thank you for joining us today, and I will let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Yep, I wrote all that stuff when I was 20 years old. So, nice. Great to be here with everybody today, and talking about the VA benefits. As Sharon mentioned, with the audience of this side and sometimes with virtual, my preference is always to take questions in presentations as we go. And handle those things, but in this type of a platform, it doesn't really work well, especially for the recording. For folks that are going to be watching it afterwards and everything else. So I do have the chat up on my screen, and I will do my best to kind of glance over at it, but I will also leave time at the end to make sure that we can go through and address questions as we need to. This presentation normally is about an hour and 45 minutes, for the full, when I do these workshops for our office for folks. So it's going to be a compressed version. I'm not going to be able to go through all of the issues with the VA benefits. We're going to focus primarily on the VA pension benefit. That's where the aid and attendance comes in. That's going to be the most, probably, I would assume, the most relevant for this audience. So that's where we'll spend the bulk of our time. But Sharon did ask me to spend some time on the other aspects of the VA benefits that we'll typically cover and talk about. So we'll do that. Always start off with understanding that the VA benefits that are available are still underutilized out there. A lot of folks don't take advantage of the benefits. I'm a 31-year Navy guy myself, just retired at the end of September of last year. From the Navy. But very commonly, as we're talking with folks about the military service and asking if they've done anything with the VA, very common refrain is, no, I don't have anything. I want to make sure that the people who really need it, get the benefit. I don't want to come in and ask for a benefit, or they assume that they're not eligible for any benefit because they don't think they served long enough. Or a host of other reasons that people don't seek out the benefit. But they are there, and it's important to understand what they are and how they work, and more about understanding that any veteran applying for benefits is not taking the benefit away from another veteran. It's there for all veterans, not just for some. So you just need to reach out and do that. So the VA programs, if vast oversimplification, can be separated into three primary pillars. The two biggest pillars of the VA where the bulk of the VA money goes to is in the service-connected disability compensation benefit and in the healthcare benefits. Those are the two primary pillars. That's where the bulk of VA money is spent through their budgetary process is paying out disability compensation claims and paying for all of the medical pieces of it. So I'm going to touch on those two pieces a little bit. We're not going to touch on at all any of the other ancillary benefits, the burial benefits, home loans, life insurance, post 9/11 GI Bill benefits, a bunch of other VA programs that are out there. We're not going to go into those. We're just not going to have time to address any of those today. But the third part of it that we will talk about at the bottom is the non-service connected pension benefit. That's where we'll spend the bulk of our time. The last time we had major changes to this program was in 2018. Completely rewrote how the pension program is operated and how you qualify and the eligibility rules were completely redone in 2018. Didn't change anything for the disability compensation or medical pieces of it, but for the pension benefits, now it's 7 years removed now. So most people are very familiar with where things are now with that. But starting with the disability compensation is a payment compensation or a payment to the veteran for an injury or an illness that was incurred during a period of active duty, was aggravated or otherwise affected them, but it is tied back to an active duty occurrence of that. So the disability compensation requires that service connection in order to receive the benefit that would be eligible. The the evidence of the injury does not have to necessarily be apparent during the active duty, but whatever caused that accident, that injury or illness, has to be able to be tied back to it. So it's not unusual, especially for many of our Vietnam era veterans, for them to have an illness that they would be diagnosed with, 30, 40, 50 years after their exposure or their service, that they didn't know they had. It was there, but it was just dormant, and then it came up later. But they can still tie that back to an active duty service to be able to get that service connection for that. The disability compensation is not combat related. There is a separate benefit for combat injuries on top of the service connected disability. We're not going to do combat stuff here today either. But it doesn't require combat. And that's where a lot of people get confused about, is that they think that because they weren't boots on the ground in a war zone, that whatever that they happen to them, that it's not going to be helpful or they're not going to be able to drive the benefit. So the disability compensation is not like Social Security disability. As you know from dealing with these issues, Social Security disability is an all or none, right? You're either 100% disabled or you're not disabled. It's black or white. It's a binary, on or off. VA disability is not like that. VA disability doesn't mean that you can't work. It's that you have an injury or an illness that was incurred during or aggravated during a period of active duty service. You may still be fully capable of working and earning a living, but that doesn't mean that you're not eligible for compensation for the injury or illness that you incurred. And so the VA disability payments are that compensation, not based upon your ability to work, but what that level of injury or illness is and how disabling that is. The disabilities are all based upon a percentage of the disability. You can actually have a 0% rating, but still have a confirmed disability, just no compensation. And then 10% all the way up to 100% for the ratings that you would have. The amount of compensation that you are paid is based upon your rating, disability rating. And so for the lowest compensation, so the most common rating that I see, at least I'm about, is a hearing issue, right? The ringing, the tinnitus, the ringing in the ears, hearing loss, very, very common disability rating across the board, which is generally that 10% disability rating. If that's the only thing that someone has, there's um, a 10% disability rating that would be there. So for the lowest two disability ratings, that 10 and 20% disability rating, there's just a flat amount that the veteran would receive, regardless of their marital status or dependency status. As you get to the 30% and higher, the benefit is going to depend upon whether the veteran is a single individual or whether they are married or have a dependent from that. And so you'll see on that screen where they break those down for the different levels. 100% disability rating for the veteran is $3,800. That would be on top of, not in place of, any military pension benefits they would have. So if they were retirees, which of course you do not have to be a retiree to receive disability compensation, you just have to have that wartime or the active duty service that triggers the injury or illness. But if you did retire from the military and you have a payment from the Department of Defense for your military pension, the VA disability compensation is on top of that after your I think it's the 40% line is where the concurrent receipt changes. So if your disability rating is under 40%, they're going to reduce your pension by the amount of your VA benefit so that you get this, whatever your pension amount is, you're going to have it broken out in pension and disability. The disability piece is tax-free. The pension piece is taxable. Once you get above that 40% mark, your pension benefit remains full, and then you get the VA benefit on top of that pension benefit. There's been movement to eliminate the concurrent receipt penalty, as it's often referred to, for the all VA disability compensation payments, so that a pension benefit isn't reduced. But so far, it's only for the 40% or higher for the disability compensation. Disability compensation, like Social Security disability, is not tied to economic income or your economic status. It doesn't matter how much money you have or don't have. The veteran's financial net worth, income, or assets don't play a role in disability compensation benefits for that. You could be Bill Gates and still get your disability compensation. I got to change that. Bill's kind of been outdated now with those. So got Elon or Bezos or whomever it is. Pick your billionaire of choice. It doesn't matter how much money you have. If the veteran if receiving disability compensation benefits dies as a result of that, tied to that service-connected injury or illness, then the surviving spouse would be eligible for what's called a DIC benefit, which is dependency and indemnity compensation. So after the disabled veteran's death, the surviving spouse would have to apply for and then be able to receive the DIC benefit in that veteran's place for the surviving spouse's lifetime. So that's really it on the disability compensation, just to kind of hit the high pieces of it. The other piece of it, where it folds into this next conversation of the medical benefits, is we'll come back and talk a little bit about the disability as we fold into this. But the medical piece of it is access to hospitals, right? Access to VA hospitals, to clinics, to medical care. That's available for veterans as well, to have access to the VA facilities and providing that benefit for them. I could go into the VA hospital right now or to the VA healthcare system right now, even though I do not have any service-connected disability benefit or any issues with that. I could go into the VA hospitals right now or go into the VA healthcare by virtue of my status as a veteran. But right now, if I were to go into it, I'm going to be in the lowest level of priority, among the lowest level of priorities for the for that medical benefit. They prioritize the medical benefit based upon a whole host of different levels of care as to who is going to get the benefit, and then more importantly, what that individual has to pay for their medical benefits. So what is it their share of cost, or what is it that their deductibles are going to be and they have to pay? And so that is going to be based upon what prioritization level that you meet for the VA in dealing with that. So if I were to go in today, they're going to want to know all my financial information because I'm going to have to make a payment to the VA based upon what my income and my assets are to receive the VA services, assuming that they have any space available to even see me based upon the prioritization that I would have for those benefits. As your disability rating increases, your share of cost or your out-of-pocket expense for those services decreases. So you pay less for the cost of care that you receive in the VA medical treatment facilities for those, or the VA facilities, excuse me, not medical treatment or the active duty side. The VA facilities, the hospitals or the clinics. The higher your disability rating, the lower you are. The kind of the line in the sand where we like to see from our standpoint when we're dealing with long-term care and other issues is the 70% disability rating. Once somebody attains 70% disability rating, they become fully eligible for across the board for the medical benefits, including the long-term care medical benefits that the VA has available without the copays or the deductibles. They become fully eligible for those. So if you've got any wards out there that have a 70% or higher VA disability rating, then you definitely want to be taking advantage of all of the medical benefits, the long-term care benefits for people in their homes or the VA facilities for the long-term care to be able to provide those extra supports and services for those benefits for the medical. So those are the pieces of on the disability compensation and medical, just to really touch the wave tops on them, just to address them. But I really wanted to spend the bulk of our time talking about the VA pension program, the non-service connected pension program, because this is the program that has the widest funnel at the top. So as you look at the funnel for the disability compensation benefits, that funnel triggers service-connected injury or illness. So the funnel's not as broad as the VA pension benefit program. And I know the pension, the name, the moniker pension drives people crazy because a lot of times people presume that when you hear the word pension, that means retirement. Right? You had to retire from the service in order to get a pension. That's a Department of Defense pension benefit, not a VA pension benefit. The VA pension, they call it a pension just because it's a monetary amount that they are paying to the individual as a safety net program. The VA pension benefit is more akin to SSI. So the disability compensation is akin to Social Security disability, although very different, as we talked about. The VA pension program is more in alignment with what we think about with SSI. That's the safety net program, right? It's an economic level below which we as a nation don't want our wartime veterans to fall. So SSI is the safety net for any disabled individual that's a U.S. citizen of the United States. The VA pension is the safety net program for wartime veterans. There's a monetary benefit of up to $27.95 a month that would be paid directly to the wartime veteran or the surviving spouse of the wartime veteran, but it is based upon need. There is no service-connected component to this. So it's the non-service-connected pension benefit is the technical name of it for that. So you do not have to have any connection to the need for the benefit doesn't have to be tied back to your active duty service. There are three levels of benefit that are available. There's a basic benefit. That's kind of the SSI equivalent, if you will. So a base level pension benefit, a minimum level of income that we want to make sure that wartime veterans have. And then there's on top of that baseline pension, there's an additional amount that can be added if someone is housebound. Housebound means that they can no longer drive because of a diagnosis that they have, and they are dependent on others in order to get them to and from different locations or different appointments as a housebound individual. And then the one that we all know about and talk about is the aid and attendance addition. So very commonly, this benefit is just shorthandedly referred to as the VA aid and attendance benefit. But the long name, which is why nobody uses it, is the non-service connected pension benefit with aid and attendance for that. So the aid and attendance is the additional bonus on top of the base pension that is available when someone requires assistance with at least two activities of daily living or requires supervision to protect the individual from the hazards and dangers incident to daily living because of the cognitive impairment that they may be having. And so that's the trigger for the aid and attendance bump on top of the pension benefit. The threshold requirements for the VA pension benefit are much easier generally to meet than the threshold for Medicaid, but there's some overlap and similarities from those. You have to first you have to have a disability or be age 65 or older. So under the VA rules, if you once you've attained the age of 65, you no longer have to satisfy the disabled criteria. It is either 65 or if you're under 65, then you have to approve that you are in fact disabled for the VA pension benefit. But once you're 65, that's the only requirement. 90 days of continuous active duty service for any periods of time, Vietnam era war or earlier. The line in the sand changed in this in 1985, I believe, or 1980. It's right there on my slide. 1980, the dates changed, and so for any service that has started after 1980 requires 2 years of continuous active duty service. So my active duty service started in 1993 after I graduated law school and received my commission to the Navy. And so for my VA benefits would have required the 2 years active duty continuous service for me to be eligible. Anybody else? But Vietnam era and earlier was only 90 days. So short period of time, one day of which has to be during a time of war. Next slide, we're going to come back. I'll show you there's the wartime periods. You either meet them or you don't. There's no wiggle room here on the wartime periods. You were discharged from the service for a reason other than dishonorable. I'm not going to have time to go into all the bases for discharge this morning on those, but there are administrative and punitive discharges. Punitive discharges are criminal as a result of a criminal conviction through a courts-martial, and administrative discharges are you're fired for one reason or another, or you completed your service and you were discharged. Those are your administrative discharge. The vast, vast majority of people who serve on active duty are honorably discharged. They receive an honorable discharge, but there are a whole host of other types of discharge that they can receive. The only categorical disqualifying type of discharge is a dishonorable discharge, which is through a courts-martial. For our purposes, I'm going to refer to an honorable discharge because that's what most people have. Just understand that it doesn't, if you've got a ward out there who has a OTH or a general or some other form of discharge, doesn't necessarily mean that they can't get the VA benefit, but there's extra hoops they'd have to jump through. And then for the surviving spouse of the veteran, the surviving spouse cannot have remarried. If the surviving spouse remarries, then they will lose the eligibility for that former spouse that predeceased. for those. So those are the categorical, or what I call your threshold requirements that you have to meet. So the primary ones are 90 days of active duty service, continuous active duty, at least one day of which was during the time of war, discharged under honorable conditions. Your wartime periods are all there for us. We are really starting. I can't remember the last time I saw a World War II era veteran now that would qualify. Still see some straggler Korean War, Korean conflict veterans that are coming through, but the bulk of them are either one of two things. They're either the Vietnam era or they're the gap period. My father-in-law was in the gap between Korea and Nam. So he served in the Navy for 4 years, but all 4 of his years of active duty service were peacetime, post-Korea, pre-Nam. And so he did not have at least one day that overlapped in the Korean War conflict or in the Vietnam era conflict. The Vietnam era generally for everybody started in August of 64, unless you were boots on ground. If you were boots on ground, then they backdate it to February 61. But for anybody else, it was August of 64. So we had a 9-year period, a little over a 9.5-year period between Korea and Vietnam for people who may have served that did not have the opportunity to have that one day of overlap. So currently, our most common that we are seeing is either that gap period where they have no VA eligibility because they didn't have any wartime service, or the Vietnam era eligibility. And those are what we're seeing currently. Just anecdotally, you'll see that the Gulf War, my wartime period for me was started in August of 90 and still has not closed. So when you look back at some of these other wartime periods, you see that they were, relatively speaking, short periods that triggered this VA pension benefit. But there will come a time here in the not too distant future where everybody that was served, all you had to have is 2 years of service, and you're going to have a wartime period because it's been a continuous wartime period for this purpose since 1990, for 35 years now. So that's where we are with the wartime periods. The pension, so those are your threshold criteria. Then we have your financial criteria for eligibility. The financial criteria are income and assets, what the VA calls net worth for your assets. And then there's a look back period for people who artificially created their net worth eligibility by transferring assets. Those are your financial criteria for eligibility. And you got to meet all 3 of them. The income eligibility works very differently than Medicaid, where Medicaid just has that arbitrary income cap that you have for eligibility. The VA benefit is they base their income on eligibility, as you'll see in a moment, based upon what your income is after your unreimbursed medical expenses. But they start off defining income similar to Medicaid, right, as any recurring money that is coming in to the veteran. It doesn't have to be taxable income. So it's not whether there's a 1099 or whether it's going to be reported on my tax return. It's a question of whether there is any payment of any kind from any source, any money that is coming to the veteran, whether it's a recurring payment, whether it's irregular, or whether it's just a one-off. Any money coming into that veteran is income for VA purposes. And then they exclude, there's some statutory exclusions, which we very rarely see. I'm not going to go into for now. The main exclusion for income are those unreimbursed medical expenses. And the way that they determine eligibility for income for VA purposes is to take that gross household income. So similar, again, Medicaid distinction. Medicaid only looks at the income of the applicant. The VA is looking at the household income. So whether you're single or married, they're looking at the total household income. And so even though the spouse may not be applying for a benefit yet, so to speak, the spouse's income is still going to be included in determining the veteran's eligibility, or the veteran's income for eligibility purposes. So gross household income minus the unreimbursed medical expenses equals income for VA purposes or IVAP. That's how we determine the income. What are some of those unreimbursed medical expenses? Here's a list of them, and these slides will be available afterwards for y'all. But your medical expenses, your typical ones that you might think of, doctors, hospitals, insurance premiums is ones that sometimes gets overlooked as an unreimbursed medical expense, especially long-term care insurance, which typically may have higher premiums than just a Medicare supplement policy may have. But the biggest issue that we run into on the unreimbursed medical expenses is what is is there a cost for where they are living, the facility cost. Prior to the 2018 changes, there was some confusion or distinctions between the type of facility, a nursing home, assisted living, or an independent living facility. The 2018 changes clarified some of that, where we still have clearly, if you're in a nursing home or assisted living facility, that is an unreimbursed medical expense that will reduce your income for VA purposes, but it no longer requires you to be in that assisted living. If you're in an independent living setting, there is the potential that you can include the rent at that independent living facility as an unreimbursed medical expense if you trigger the activities of daily living requirements. So if you trigger those assistance with the two activities of daily living, or that you needed that living arrangement because of the cognitive impairment, then you may be able to get the independent living facility rent included as a UME for those. So looking at examples of how this would work, if we've got a married couple, their gross income is $48,000 a year, their household income, and then we look at what their unreimbursed medical expenses are. So they got their Part B premiums that are coming out of their Social Security. They're each paying a supplemental health insurance. They got $142 of medications, and they're in an assisted living facility that's charging $4,000 a month. You add up all of those projected unreimbursed medical expenses, it's a little over $59,000 a year in total expenses. There's a deductible that the VA applies. Don't worry about that for now. But for purposes of this, the projected unreimbursed medical expenses for the year are then $58,000. You'll see that the VA does everything on an annualized, whereas Medicaid does everything monthly, right? The Medicaid always changes, is always prorated is always taking all of those numbers and making them into a monthly amount. The VA turns everything into an annual amount. And so they take those projected UMEs of $58,000, they deduct that from their income. This number would result in a negative $10,000 or change, but the VA doesn't ever go into a negative. They just stop at zero. And so when your income for VA purposes is reduced to zero, then you're eligible for the full pension benefit. The maximum pension benefit for a married individual with, or for a veteran with a spouse, is that $33,548 divided by 12 is the $27.95 a month. So because there is no income remaining, their income for VA purposes is zero, they get the full benefit. So that's how the income works for example, for a married individual. I'll give you an example of a single individual living in their own home. Single individual living in their own home, $3,000 a month of gross income. Part B, health insurance, medications, doctor copays, deductibles. Not a lot of medical expenses for this individual living at home. So their total projected UMEs is $7,600 a year. Which after the deductible is $6,700 of UMEs for calculation of IVAP purposes. Take that gross income, $36,000, subtract those projected UMEs, a little over $29,000 of income for VA purposes. We then take the maximum allowable pension for that single veteran, which is currently $28,300, and we see that the veteran's income exceeds that. Right? They've got more income than what the maximum VA pension would be. So the VA says you don't need our help because your income exceeds what our pension benefit would be. So your income isn't low enough to trigger any assistance through the VA. Now, what we all know is that that individual is only in their home because most of the time because somebody else is helping, right? There is another family member who is actually doing things and assisting with that loved one being able to stay at home, typically an adult child that is involved in that, but they're just not getting paid to do those things. They're just doing it because it's mom or dad and they love them and they want to be there for them. But if there was a family caregiver that was providing assistance with those ADLs or the instrumental activities of daily living, that was doing things for mom or dad, that was allowing them to stay in their home, you can pay them. You can pay them through a personal service contract on a month-to-month basis to provide those services. And if this individual was doing that and just paying that family member $2,000 a month towards the cost of their care, now they've bumped up their projected UMEs to $30,000 a year, coming back to their income, 36,000 of income minus the 30,000. They still have a little bit of income left over, right? A little over $5,000 of income for VA purposes. So that means they're not going to trigger the full pension benefit, but they'll still get $1,922 a month from the VA through that pension benefit to help cover that gap for there. So paying a family member can result in triggering the VA pension benefit, even if they're not in a facility. Now, payment of family caregivers has a host of other issues and challenges that we don't have time to go into right now. Income tax consequence to the family caregiver. Always family dynamics are going to play a role in this. Understanding that just because we're paying the family member $2,000 doesn't mean that that money is now the child's for them to use as part of their family's budget. Even though technically that is correct, practically the idea is you're paying child the $2,000, but child is turning around and using that $2,000 a month to help mom and dad and using it for them. But we just have to trigger the payment in order to get the IVAP increased. So lots of conversations about how that works and when it's appropriate, but just understanding that that's an option to help reduce income for IVAP purposes in order to do that. So that's the income piece of it. The asset piece of it then is the net worth piece, that their assets have to be below a certain level. This used to be a hugely complicated equation prior to the 2018 changes. Now it's a binary. It's a black and white. It's a line in the sand, $159,240. It doesn't matter if you're married or single. It's $159,240. So for single veterans, it's a substantially higher safety net than Medicaid at $2,000. For married couples, it's a little bit higher of a safety net than Medicaid, but it's technically about the same. The current for Medicaid, it's currently $157,920 is the community spouse limit, but there's also a $2,000 Medicaid applicant. So when you add them together, it's roughly the same amount, the $159,240. So that is, and again, regardless of age, regardless of married or single, it's a flat $159,240 is the asset limit that we have. Now, there are assets that the VA excludes from the calculation. There is a primary residence exclusion, but it's not generally it can or sometimes be as generous or sometimes more generous, different than Medicaid, right? Medicaid, as a general rule, your home is your castle. It is excluded. Unless you're a single individual, then there's an equity limit for the homestead in that exclusion. For VA purposes, there is no equity amount that is relevant. It's an acreage limitation. So your primary residence, as long as it is on acreage of 2 acres or less, is excluded regardless of its value. If you have an individual who lives, whose home is on acreage in excess of 2 acres, then you have to go through a determination as, is the excess acreage marketable? Can there be a division of that property and the excess acreage sold to provide money for the veteran? If it is marketable and can be sold, then the value of that excess acreage is countable towards the $159,000. If the individual lives on 5 acres in a deed restricted community that does not allow homes to be built on property of less than 5 acres, then that excess 3 acres is not marketable, right? You can't sell it because nobody can do anything with it. So therefore, under those circumstances, it would be excluded if it is not marketable. So you got to look at the property to determine that, but it's a 2 acreage limitation. The stuff inside the home doesn't count. Vehicles like Medicaid generally are not countable, prepaid burial, and anything that was transferred more than 36 months ago. VA, as we'll talk about in a moment, has a 3-year, 36-month look back period, whereas Medicaid has the 5-year, 60-month look back period. So that's what's excluded. Everything else generally counts. Checking accounts, savings accounts, stocks, bonds. Primary distinction between Medicaid and VA, VA counts the principal value in IRAs, 401s, any retirement accounts. Those are assets in addition to the RMDs being treated as income. So you get them counted in both ways through the VA, whereas Medicaid only counts the RMDs as income for eligibility under the Medicaid program. The VA counts them as both assets and as income. Additional property other than your primary residence. Again, this is where Medicaid and VA will be a distinguishing. You could have your homestead and then another parcel of property that is rented. And that rental property, the value of the property would be excluded as a resource for Medicaid. It is counted as a resource for VA if it is not the primary residence that is the rental. If it is a secondary residence that's the rental, it is counted as an asset. So broader category of inclusion of assets for net worth purposes, and then the transfer of assets is similar to the way Medicaid works, but a little bit different. From that, we've already talked about there's the 3-year instead of the 5-year, but the VA is only going to penalize what's referred to as the transfer of a covered asset. A covered asset is an asset that if you did not transfer it, it would have made you ineligible for the VA benefit. And so if you did not transfer it and you still had it today, you would be ineligible. That's what they're going to penalize for VA purposes. And I'm going to go through examples of the transfer of assets so you can see how that works. But exclusions from the transfer of assets, if it was more than 36 months ago, it's beyond the look back, it doesn't count. If but for the transfer, you still would have been under the $159,000 limit. They're not going to penalize that. And that's similar to Medicaid has a similar rule for that. If you're under the community spouse resource allowance, they're not going to penalize the transfer either if you would have done that. The transfer dependent child or transfers that were as a result of fraud or unfair business practices, those will be excluded. There is no hardship exception under the VA rules for transfers of assets. So the way that they would determine how long someone would be ineligible for the VA benefit is they're going to take the amount of the transfer and divide it by the maximum pension benefit that is available, which is currently that $27.95, right? The maximum pension benefit for a veteran with a dependent divided by 12 is the $27.95. The penalty starts from the first day of the month after the transfer. So VA's penalties are applicable under the old Medicaid rules where they started the month after the transfer, not when an application is filed, as Medicaid penalty periods are currently assigned. So, and then there's a maximum penalty period of 5 years that is going to be applied. So some examples of the penalty period. Claimant's net worth $229,000, transfers $70,000, remaining net worth is $159,000, so he's under the net worth limit, applies for the the pension benefit within 36 months of making that transfer, the penalty period is 25 months. So if he didn't make that $70,000 transfer, he would have had 229,000. He would have been over the net worth limit. So they're going to penalize the full amount on that, and they'll make him ineligible for Medicaid for 25 months, starting the month after the transfer. So if this individual applied for VA benefits at month 28 after making that $70,000 transfer and waited 28 months to apply, then that $70,000 transfer wouldn't impact the Medicaid or the VA benefits, even though it's within 36 months, right? It's within 36, so you have to disclose it. But because the penalty period ended at month 25 and he's not applying until month 28, then he's already beyond that penalty period and it wouldn't impact eligibility. So the only time you actually have to wait the full 36 months is if the penalty period exceeds 36 months. Then you got to wait the full 36 months. Otherwise, a transfer could make you eligible sooner than 36 months, completely different than how Medicaid does their penalties. Another example applies for pension in January of 2025. At the time of the application, his net worth is 125, but 2 years earlier transferred $30,000 cash and a $30,000 vehicle a year earlier for those. So $60,000 in total transfers. What is the consequence of those transfers for an application in January? Well, for this individual, there's no consequence because the vehicle is not a countable asset. It is an exempt asset. And so had they not transferred the vehicle and still had the vehicle, it wouldn't have been counted as an asset. Therefore, the transfer is not penalized for that vehicle. So the only potentially penalizable transfer was the $30,000 of cash. But if you add 30 to 125, that's 155,000. Net worth limit is 159. So even if they hadn't transferred the 30 grand, they still would have been under 159,000. So that is not penalized either. So even though there was $60,000 of relevant transfers, none of them were penalizable because they weren't covered assets that were made for those transfers from there. So that's the quick rundown of how they work. From a planning standpoint, there's two approaches to planning. There's preventative planning before need arises and crisis planning at time of need. Crisis planning for asset side, improvements to home. A lot of the things we see in the Medicaid world, right? You're taking available assets, converting them into excluded assets through improvements to home, vehicles, pre-need burials, any items that we need. The 2018 eliminated what was a very common technique of purchasing single premium immediate annuities. Those are transfers of assets now if done within 3 years of applying for Medicaid. So the purchase of an annuity is no longer an effective planning technique for assets. Crisis planning for income most commonly is going to be creating more unreimbursed medical expenses, and that's going to be through payment for caregivers to increase those unreimbursed medical expenses, looking at including the independent living facility rent through confirmation that the living arrangement is necessary for the cognitive impairment and or they are receiving the additional activities of daily living support from a third party that is providing those. So not a lot of wiggle room anymore in the crisis planning world for VA benefits, although there are still some things we can do. Preventative planning, beyond what you're probably not going to be relevant for most of y'all, but what we would do as a general rule as we're talking with clients is looking at creation of irrevocable trusts and transferring assets to irrevocable trusts to start that 36-month clock ticking so that the assets, once we get beyond that period, are protected and excluded as resources. To the extent that you're dealing in guardianships, you're probably not going to be able to do those types of transfers in dealing with that. It's more of a preventative planning before for the client before those things would happen. So I know that was a lot of information really, really fast. Hopefully everybody follows. I did see questions that were popping up, but I intentionally didn't look at them closely because I wanted to make sure that I was able to get through everything before the noon hour click. So let me come back now and look at those questions. If anybody else has questions, feel free to pop them over in chat, and we can go through them. I'm going to go through them in reverse order for this to answer these. So first question, would the VSO officer be an individual to assist with processing of this information to ensure that they're receiving the funds? So I apologize. I don't know the timing of when that question came in as to which information, but if we're talking about the unreimbursed medical expenses and the caregiver expenses that are triggered with that, then yes, the VSO, whomever is you're presenting that information to the VSO, and they would be the ones who would be responsible for processing that information. Any of the UMEs, providing it to them so that they could report that up the chain to be able to identify those things. Adult family care facility or group home qualify potentially if they're privately paying for those. That those could qualify as unreimbursed medical expenses. Now, to the extent that the adult family care facility or group home is being paid for through Medicaid or through some other source where it is now it's not an unreimbursed expense because somebody else is paying it or some other benefit is covering it, then it wouldn't be a UME. But if it was a private pay expense and it was coming from the veteran's money that was going towards that payment, then it could potentially qualify as an unreimbursed medical expense as long as the activities of daily living component is met or the cognitive impairment component is met for that. Next one was when you describe this spouse benefit, does that also apply to disabled children for ID child of the veteran? Good question. So yes, if the child is recognized as a dependent of the veteran, as a result of their ID or their developmental disability, intellectual disability, whatever it may be, if they are still recognized by the VA in DEERS as a dependent, then yes, a dependent child, adult disabled child can still qualify as a dependent for those calculation purposes. And there's actually a different benefit if there is a spouse and a dependent child. Some of these numbers do change along the way for disability compensation or the pension benefit. So yes, but the key is that they have to be recognized. It's not enough just that they're disabled. They got to be recognized in the VA system as a dependent child of that veteran still to be able to trigger that benefit. Does the vet have to opt into that for the spouse during their life prior to dying? So that, I think, was addressed to the DIC benefit, to the disability indemnity compensation benefit. And no, they're not. So where the veteran has to opt in is for the Department of Defense pension benefit. When you receive a pension benefit at the time you retire and start drawing pay, you have to elect, do I want my pension benefit to be paid for my lifetime, or do I want to provide a survivor benefit option for my spouse? So for the pension benefit, you must elect that at the time you start drawing your pension as to how you want it to be paid. But for the VA disability benefit, as long as the veteran was receiving the disability benefit for a long enough period of time, and I apologize, the number just escaped me. I can't recall. The veteran does have to be receiving the disability compensation at the sufficient level for. I don't even want to say the number because it's not coming to my head right now, but there is a time frame. So if hypothetically the veteran was approved for disability compensation at 100%, received it for 6 months and then died, the surviving spouse isn't going to be eligible. I know it's longer than 6 months. It's at least a year that the disability compensation benefit has to be paid. But as long as the veteran meets those criteria and dies as a result of the service-connected injury or illness. So that's the issue that you got to be careful about when you have a service-connected veteran who dies. You want to make sure that the death certificate, that the cause of death has listed among the causes. It doesn't have to be number one, but you want to make sure that the cause of death on that death certificate includes a contributing factor of whatever it was that was causing them to be disabled to trigger the disability compensation benefit. You want to have that, close that loop with it to show that it's on there. But then the surviving spouse can apply for the DIC benefit, and it doesn't require the veteran to say that the spouse can do that for that one, assuming that's what that one was. That was from Sharon. Is the pension payment always taxable? The pension payment is not taxable. So the VA pension benefit is a tax-free benefit, as is disability compensation. All VA benefits are not not taxable. They're all tax-free benefits. Computer problems. All right. So 2 messages at the back. Client who is widowed. I have DD 214. How can I find out if she's eligible for benefits? So you got to first you got to look at the DD 214 to see what period of service did the veteran have. Did it line up with one of the wartime periods for that veteran? So was there at least 90 days of active duty service? That's almost always a given, but not always. And then the DD 214 will show the periods of service. So did those periods of service have at least one day of which overlapped with a wartime period? If there was 90 days of active duty service, at least one day of which overlapped, the widow and they were married at the time of the veteran's death, and the surviving spouse has not remarried, then she meets all the categorical or those threshold requirements. From there, it's just going to be financial eligibility. Does she have IVAP? What is her net worth? And is she able to trigger the benefit for the widow that would be available? And then how can we access the VA file number if we don't have discharge paperwork? We get nowhere applying for funds without that number. I apologize. I don't know what the VA file number. I don't know how you would do that. I mean, but the veterans service number, depending on when they served, right? So when I served, the service number was our social security numbers, but they changed that. Now you have a DOD ID number, which we had prior to in World War II. There were DOD ID numbers. Then they changed to social security numbers. Now we're back to DOD ID numbers. But that's going to be if they already had a VA application that they filed, then you would just have to, I don't know how you would get a file number from the VA absent talking to someone in the VA to be able to identify that. But, getting veterans documents, getting a DD 214, getting the veterans paperwork, that you should only need their social security number or DOD ID number, however they were identified, to be able to get that in there. And I think that is it. Does the wartime period include burn pit locations, or is that a different topic of discussion? It's not a different topic. It's an important distinction, and I apologize if I didn't make it clear. It doesn't require you to be in an area of conflict. It requires you to have service during the wartime period. So my active duty service initially was in Gulfport, Mississippi, and Washington, D.C. I had, that was my initial 4 years of active duty. It was all during a wartime period, but we weren't in a conflict area at that time. It was still, relatively speaking, peacetime service, even though technically we're in a wartime period as a result of Gulf War I when I was in law school in 1990. So all of my service was during a wartime period, even though I was not in a conflict area. I was not boots on the ground. In 2008, I was recalled and went over into Iraq and served in one of these burn pit areas. Um, but that's not that burn pit, serving in combat in a downrange area is not a requirement for wartime service. It's just being on active duty that triggers the wartime service during those periods of time. Burn pit becomes a question of disability compensation and will be similar to the Agent Orange exposure for automatic eligibility for VA disability benefits. We will have some presumptive disability benefits for burn pit veterans as well. That's where that'll come in, a much broader, different conversation from there. And then I think I'm done, but I'm going to go ahead and this last question. Veteran that's 100% disability receives $5,000 a month from the VA and 1,000 from Social Security. ALF just went up to 55. Can I get additional funds from the VA? So if you're already maxed out, then probably not. If you're already getting the full disability and an aid and attendance benefit, and the aid and attendance benefit is not the full aid and attendance, it's just a small bump up in addition to that for that. Now the technically at 100% disability rating, actually under the medical piece of that, the VA is on the hook for the care. So you might be able to get some additional funds from the VA under the medical, not under the disability or the pension benefit, but under the medical benefit for them to be able to provide the assistance because at 100% disability rating, the veterans, VA is on the hook for all of those medical expenses. If they were in a nursing home level, without a doubt, they could go into a VA nursing home, or the VA would have contracts with nursing homes to cover that. I'm not 100% sure in the ALF side how that would work because the VA doesn't really have any assisted living settings. But if the VA has a contract with that assistant, it might require them to transfer to a facility that they have a contract with. But that answer is all going to be on the medical piece, not the disability or the pension piece, where you'd potentially get additional funds from there. So, Sharon, back to you. Thank
Well,
you.
Randy, that was just really great information. I definitely picked up a few things that I didn't know before. So thank you very much. And thank you for allowing us to share this on our website after the presentation. Everybody look for an email from Kate. And next month, we have on April 9th, Lenora Spence is going to speak with us. She's with the Florida Department of Agricultural Division of Consumer Services. I've seen her presentation, and it's really interesting on consumer scams and fraud prevention and all of that. And she is super knowledgeable. So I hope you can join us then. Everybody, make it a great day. Thank you.